She always believed that their love was strong and their marriage honest. But after Edgar Delaney's death, Marilyn discovered a truth he never spoke of. A past buried in war. A letter that changed everything, and a search for answers that could rewrite the story they thought they knew. Before we dive into the story, let me know where you're tuning in from today. She had lost Edgar only a few months earlier, after nearly 40 years of marriage. He was a reserved, thoughtful man, an engineer by trade, whose quiet intelligence showed in the way he measured every word and action. He once worked with military radio technology during the Cold War, though he spoke little about that time. Marilyn had learned to accept his reticence, loving him for the care he took in all things. He was not prone to large gestures or dramatic confessions. Instead, he was steadfast, methodical, always ensuring that their life together was stable and secure. They had built a comfortable life in a modest suburban home, the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other over short hedges and children passed by on their bikes after school. His final illness was mercifully brief, if such a word can be used for something so devastating. He was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer, and within a few weeks he slipped away, leaving Marilyn numb in her grief. Even at the end, he had said little. He would hold her hand, gaze at her with a mixture of sorrow and affection, but never utter those last, dramatic confessions people sometimes speak of in stories. He simply asked her to forgive him for anything he never told her. At the time, she thought he meant the small regrets that gather in any marriage. Now, she wondered if he had carried far heavier secrets. In the months following his death, she busied herself with the mundane tasks of widowhood. Managing finances, sorting through old clothes, writing thank-you notes for condolence bouquets. She had never lived alone, and at times the silence in the house felt oppressive. She found herself wandering from room to room, almost expecting to see him seated at the kitchen table or tinkering in his workshop. She missed his presence acutely, the soft click of him locking the back door each night, the faint hum as he tested a new piece of radio gear. Small details rose in her memory, pieces of him that reminded her how intimately they had woven their lives together. Yet something drew her again and again to the attic, that rarely visited space where Edgar kept the old equipment from his days working with radio transmissions. He had always been meticulous in storing each coil of wire, each circuit board, each battered shortwave receiver. He once told her about number stations, cryptic broadcasts that transmitted coded sequences for intelligence operatives. Marilyn recalled how he mentioned they all but disappeared after the Cold War ended, replaced by more modern methods of espionage. She had believed him, never questioning whether he might still follow them. One evening, in her restlessness, she climbed the attic stairs. The space smelled of dust and old cardboard. Streaks of sunlight through the small attic window fell on a series of metal cabinets, all labeled in Edgar's precise handwriting. Cables, spare parts, test equipment. She spotted an older shortwave receiver sitting on a table, a few wires trailing from its back. A wave of nostalgia passed over her. She remembered how Edgar would sometimes retreat here with headphones, scanning across obscure frequencies. She thought of trying it, though the idea felt absurd. Would it even work after months, perhaps years, of disuse? She eased the receiver onto a sturdier table, checked the power cord for fraying, then plugged it in. The dial glowed a faint orange. She felt a flicker of excitement, as if bridging a gap into Edgar's world. She turned the tuning knob. Static hissed, crackled, then settled into a low hum. For a long moment, she heard nothing but random radio noise. She wondered if she had made a mistake, if this old technology was too far gone to yield anything. Then, abruptly, a strange series of clicks emerged, followed by a slow, mechanical voice reciting numbers. 4, 9, Echo, 7, 2, Bravo, 1. Marilyn's heart jolted, a chill crawling up her spine. She snatched a pen and paper, writing the sequence. She listened in stunned silence as it repeated, varying only slightly from pass to pass. This felt like a relic from a buried era, from a world she had never fully seen but that Edgar had once inhabited. When the broadcast ended, she sat in the dim attic, the note in her trembling hands. She had no idea what it meant, but she sensed it was not random. She recalled Edgar mentioning that many old number stations had either gone silent or run automated loops with no real significance. Yet this sounded alive, if that made sense. As if it were not just a relic, but an active attempt to communicate. Unsettled and uncertain, she resolved to call Gregory Sharp, a former student of Edgar's who had shared Edgar's passion for radio technology. Gregory was a man in his 30s, bright and inquisitive, and he had admired Edgar's expertise. If anyone might decipher these signals, it would be him. Gregory arrived the following afternoon, eyes filled with curiosity and concern. He greeted Marilyn warmly, then climbed to the attic with her. He inspected the shortwave receiver, listened to the odd broadcast for a few minutes, and frowned. "This is definitely a number station format," he said, leaning over the equipment. "I've read about these, but I thought they were mostly defunct by now. Let me run the sequence through some software I brought. Might take a bit to decode." They carried the receiver downstairs, setting it in a spare bedroom that Edgar had once used as a study. Gregory hooked up his laptop, typed furiously, and the computer began analyzing the patterns. Marilyn hovered, feeling both dread and anticipation. Finally, Gregory's face changed. He angled the screen to her. The message read, "Confirm position. Awaiting response. S active." Marilyn's breath caught. S. Those were Edgar's initials. She found her hand rising to her mouth. "What does that mean? ES active?" Gregory exhaled, brow furrowed. "It suggests that whoever is running this broadcast still thinks Edgar is out there in the field, maybe. They're calling for him. It's almost like they're saying, 'Report in Edgar Delaney. You're operational, right?'" A swirl of conflicting emotions overwhelmed her. Edgar had never said he was a spy. He was an engineer. He had worked for companies contracting with the military, sure, but that was just about designing or maintaining specialized radio systems, wasn't it? She looked at Gregory helplessly. He was not an agent or something like that. He was just quiet, reserved. He did mention classified projects now and then, but only in vague terms. Gregory gave her a sympathetic nod. "I can't say for certain, but from this, it seems there's a station that believes he's still responding. That's, well, quite a puzzle." Marilyn spent the night in a fog, her mind reeling with the possibility that Edgar's life was not as simple as she had believed. She remembered the boxes in the attic labeled with odd code words, the locked metal drawer he kept in his study. He had said it contained proprietary designs. Perhaps all these years, she had underestimated the scope of his involvement. The next morning, she called Gregory again. Together, they delved deeper, scanning the frequencies. The station repeated the same coded request for confirmation at intervals. The question loomed, who was on the other side? Gregory tried tracing the source of the transmission. He discovered it was relayed through multiple points, but one location kept surfacing. An abandoned site in Nova Scotia, referred to in some old reference materials as Operation Nightfall. Officially, it was decommissioned decades ago, presumably a leftover from Cold War espionage infrastructure. Yet something was apparently still operational there. Marilyn felt a strange combination of fear and resolution. She recalled how Edgar had once traveled on short, unexplained trips, always saying it was a quick job site visit. She had not asked questions. Now, she wondered if he had visited that station or helped maintain it. She made a decision that shocked even herself. She would go to Nova Scotia. Gregory, seeing her determination, offered to accompany her. He, too, was intrigued and felt protective of Edgar's memory. If someone is exploiting that station, or if some old program is still running, we need to figure it out. Edgar wouldn't want it left in limbo, Gregory said. Marilyn agreed. She believed that if Edgar had indeed carried secrets, maybe discovering them would help her find closure. They booked flights, packed warm clothes. The journey to Nova Scotia felt surreal to Marilyn. She had traveled on vacations with Edgar over the years, but never for such a strange purpose, uncovering a ghost of the Cold War. She stared out the airplane window at the gray ocean below, heart pounding with questions. She tried to recall if Edgar had ever mentioned Nova Scotia, but only faint references lingered. "I did some field tests up north," he had said once, but she had not pressed him for details. At Halifax, they rented a small SUV. The local library contained a few historical references to Operation Nightfall, but the details were vague. A remote relay station built to handle top-secret transmissions, rumored to connect with overseas intelligence networks. Officially shut down in the late 1980s, the site was said to be locked behind rusted fences. No caretaker, no guard, just left to the elements. Gregory pored over old maps, using his radio know how to guess the location. By the time they were ready to set out, the sun hung low in a wintry sky. They decided to drive partway, stay in a motel, and head to the site at first light. That night, in the motel's modest room, Marilyn scarcely slept. She pictured an abandoned building humming with ancient equipment, still dutifully broadcasting a message to her late husband. Morning brought cold winds and leaden clouds. They followed winding roads through dense pines, checking GPS coordinates Gregory had pieced together. Eventually, the pavement gave way to gravel, then to a rough track barely passable. They left the SUV behind and continued on foot, the crisp air stinging Marilyn's cheeks. At last, they glimpsed a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. A faded sign read, "Government property. No trespassing." A half-collapsed guard booth stood nearby, thoroughly deserted. Gregory found a gap in the fence, large enough to slip through. Heart-pounding, Marilyn followed him in. The compound beyond was eerie. Low buildings of concrete, windows boarded or shattered. Weeds sprouted through cracked asphalt. The hush was profound. And yet, a faint hum reached Marilyn's ears, the hum of generators, or some hidden electrical current. Gregory, scanning with a handheld device, pointed to a squat structure near the compound's center. "It's coming from there," he whispered, as if the place demanded silence. They approached a rusted metal door that stood partially ajar. Inside, darkness gave way to a faint glow from emergency lights or old overhead lamps that flickered. They followed the corridor, stepping over debris. Then they heard it, the unmistakable buzz of radio equipment. In a room that resembled a small control center, decades-old machinery lined the walls, humming in steady rhythm. Dust coated every surface, yet the gear was fully powered. A large antenna cable ran through a hole in the ceiling, presumably connecting to a still-functioning tower. Marilyn felt goosebumps. This was no mere relic. It was alive, transmitting. At a cluttered console, they found a small stack of logs, scribbled notes in both typed and handwritten form. On one page, they saw the repeated code "yes," presumably referring to Edgar Delaney. Another entry read, "Await response/keep loop open." Gregory examined a battered metal desk shoved against the wall. Its drawers were locked. After rummaging, they discovered a hidden latch. Inside, they found a notebook with Edgar's name scrawled on the first page. Marilyn's breath caught. Carefully, she lifted it out. The pages were dense with frequency charts, coded references, and short notes. One line, dated 1976, read, "If this loop remains active after my response, someone else survived. Someone I couldn't save." Then came coordinates marked Bucharest, with a date. Marilyn's stomach twisted. Bucharest was in Romania. She recalled that Edgar had once spent time in Eastern Europe, though he told her it was for an engineering contract. Now, seeing these references, she realized that he had been involved in some clandestine network. Gregory scanned more entries. There were lines referencing aborted extractions, a mention of a small group of collaborators, and repeated references to a woman named Anka. The station, it seemed, had been used to pass coded messages between Edgar and certain operatives or contacts. The final pages contained scribbled regrets, something about the mission that failed, the people who died. Marilyn closed her eyes, tears stinging. Edgar had carried these burdens alone, never telling her, perhaps out of guilt or a desire to spare her. The note about someone else survived suggested that Edgar believed at least one person from that ill-fated mission was still out there, waiting for his signal. They powered down the broadcasting equipment, uncertain if they should fully silence it yet. Part of Marilyn wanted to just yank the plug and end the ghostly transmissions once and for all. But Gregory reasoned they should wait until they understood the consequences. Instead, they left it running for the moment, taking Edgar's notebook with them. The sight, for all its gloom, felt like a museum of secrets, frozen in time. They retreated to the SUV before dusk, lock-stepping through the battered compound. A sense of unearthly quiet pressed in as they drove away, leaving that station behind but not truly erasing it. Back at their lodging, Marilyn pored over Edgar's notebook, tears slipping down her cheeks. She recalled how gentle he was with her, how unassuming. Could he have truly been involved in Cold War-era intelligence missions? The references to Bucharest, a failed extraction, haunted her. She saw the name Anca Petrescu scribbled in a margin. Attempting final rescue. Must confirm her safety. The next note, days later, read, Lost contact. Guilt endures. Marilyn realized that perhaps Edgar had tried to save this woman, but something went horribly wrong. He must have carried that regret for the rest of his life. The line about someone else survived, but never contacting him again indicated a tragic separation. Gregory suggested they try to decode some of the logs, but it was beyond his immediate capability. He recognized certain references to Romanian code words, old intelligence ciphers. Marilyn felt a growing determination to solve this puzzle. Edgar had left her a thread, and she would follow it to wherever it led. If Anca Petrescu was alive in Bucharest, she might hold the final piece to Edgar's story. It seemed outlandish to travel yet again, this time overseas, but Marilyn found her conviction strong. She could not rest until she uncovered the truth about that failed mission, about Edgar's quiet devotion to a promise. They returned home from Nova Scotia with heavy hearts. Marilyn decided to place the shortwave receiver in her bedroom temporarily, scanning occasionally to see if the station still broadcast the same call for ES. Indeed, it did, though less frequently. Gregory worried that by ignoring it, they might leave someone else in the dark. But Marilyn argued they needed more information first. They parted ways, agreeing to meet again soon. Gregory gave her a resigned smile, clearly grappling with both fascination and unease. Alone in her house once more, Marilyn read the envelope she had found the day before their trip, the one addressed in Edgar's handwriting. Inside was a brief letter. My dearest Marilyn, if you're reading this, I've left before explaining. Forgive me. Some promises can't be spoken without harming those we swore to protect. If ever you find the signals again, know that it's because a piece of my past still lingers, seeking resolution. I'm trusting you to see it through if you can, or to let it rest if that's what your heart decides. Thank you for loving me despite the silences. Yours, Edgar. Tears blurred her vision. She pressed the letter to her chest, whispering, I'll see it through, as though speaking to him across the void. The next morning, she looked up flights to Romania. Fear coiled in her stomach. Traveling alone to a country she barely knew, to chase a ghost from Edgar's past? Yet something about the letter's gentle request spurred her on. She reached out to Gregory, who said he couldn't accompany her. His job demanded his presence, and he was already pushing his luck with the Nova Scotia trip. He offered to help with research from afar. Marilyn thanked him, deciding that maybe she needed to do this alone. Preparing for the trip was both daunting and strangely empowering. She had never traveled internationally by herself. She booked a flight to Bucharest via London, arranged lodging in a small hotel near the city center, and researched local guides. She found a recommended translator service in Bucharest, emailing them about her interest in Cold War archives. A woman named Ona replied politely, offering her services to help navigate libraries and bureaucratic offices. Marilyn packed Edgar's notebook, carefully stored with plastic protectors, along with the letter. She also brought copies of the relevant transmissions from Operation Nightfall. She felt an odd pang of guilt leaving her home behind, but she reassured herself it might only be for a couple of weeks. The flight was long, her nerves thrumming with a mix of excitement and dread. As she landed in Bucharest, the reality of what she was doing hit her fully. The city itself felt like a tapestry of old and new. Communist-era blocks beside elegant historical buildings, modern cars weaving through streets overshadowed by decades of history. She checked into her modest hotel, a renovated old house with creaking floors and a friendly desk clerk. Ona arrived soon after, a petite woman with a warm but reserved demeanor. In halting English, Ona asked how she could help. Marilyn explained that she was seeking information about someone named Anka Petrescu, who might have worked with American intelligence in the 1970s. Ona blinked, brows furrowing. That could be quite difficult, she said. But we can try the National Archives, the old Securitate files maybe. Or we search phone registries, see if she is listed. So began a week of trudging through halls of dusty archives, filling out forms, dealing with suspicious archivists who eyed them warily. Ona's presence was invaluable. As she translated Marilyn's inquiries into Romanian, they found partial references to an Anka Petrescu who had once been a translator for a cultural exchange program, abruptly terminated in 1976. The record ended with a note: under suspicion of espionage, collaboration with foreign agents. File incomplete. That alone made Marilyn's heart pound. She was on the right track. She pictured Edgar, somewhere across the world, trying to rescue this woman from certain doom. They followed the trail through old address directories, discovering a listing for an Anka Petrescu that might still be valid. The phone number was defunct, but the address pointed to a quiet residential area on the outskirts of the city. With some trepidation, Marilyn and Ona took a taxi there. They found a small apartment building, gray and worn. Marilyn's heart beat wildly as she climbed the steps. If this truly was the same Anka, what would she say? The door that matched the listing was unremarkable, scratched from decades of use. Ona knocked lightly, announcing their presence in Romanian. Silence followed. Then footsteps. The door opened a crack, revealing a woman in her 70s. Hair pinned back, eyes wary. In halting Romanian, Ona introduced Marilyn, explaining that Marilyn sought a woman named Anka who once worked with Americans in the 1970s. The older woman hesitated, then softly said, "I am Anka." The timbre of her voice carried a lifetime of caution and sorrow. Marilyn's pulse hammered. She gently offered the only Romanian phrase she had memorized for this moment. "Pleased to meet you, Ms. Petrescu. I come on behalf of Edgar Delaney." At Edgar's name, Anka's expression changed entirely. Her eyes glistened, lips parting in a silent gasp. Without a word, she opened the door, ushering them inside. The apartment was modest but tidy. A small living room with threadbare couches, a shelf of worn books, and a single photo of a younger Anka standing beside a man in a Western suit. She motioned for them to sit, then sat across from them, hands trembling. "Edgar," she whispered in English. I had not heard that name in decades. Marilyn felt tears threatening. She told Anka that Edgar had passed away, explaining who she was, his wife. Anka closed her eyes briefly, sadness flickering. "He was truly gone then?" she said quietly. "I had hoped, but no, it is not surprising. The years pass." Marilyn, voice shaking, recounted the basics. They found an active broadcast referencing Edgar. They discovered logs about an abandoned station, and a mention of Bucharest, specifically of Anka. "I need to know what he did here," Marilyn said. "He never told me, but it matters to me that I understand." Anka sighed. "Yes, he would keep quiet, to protect you, or perhaps to bury the guilt." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "Edgar was my contact, my lifeline. He arranged communications so I might escape Romania. I was a translator, but the authorities suspected me of passing documents to the Americans. They threatened my family. Edgar and another operative promised to get me out, but it failed. Others died and I did not escape. In the chaos, I learned that Edgar believed me dead." Tears slipped down Marilyn's cheeks. She pictured Edgar struggling with that grief. "He never stopped feeling responsible, I think," she murmured. Anka nodded. "I tried to flee on my own later. That also failed, landing me in prison for a year. After the revolution, I returned here. I never contacted Edgar. I assumed he had moved on, or that it was too dangerous." She hesitated, voice trembling. "But sometimes, late at night, I found an old shortwave and listened for the code. The station never fully died. I believed if I heard him, it would mean he was still alive, still ready to help. But decades passed. I typed a few signals in desperation, hoping he might answer. No reply came. Marilyn realized that was what they had stumbled upon. Anka had reactivated the code, sending transmissions, hoping Edgar would respond. The broadcast from Operation Nightfall was not just a random artifact. It was Anka's lingering cry across time, seeking the man she believed might still come for her. The weight of it all crushed Marilyn's heart. She explained to Anka that Edgar had tried to maintain the station from afar, perhaps occasionally checking the signal. But as he aged, and the Cold War ended, he likely let it fade. Even so, the station's automated system remained partially alive. He carried guilt, thinking he had left comrades to die, Marilyn said softly. He never told me details, only that he had regrets. But he was a good man, truly. Anka's eyes brimmed with tears. I know. He was kind, determined. He risked much to help me and that other group. We all believed in a cause that was bigger than us. But the politics were so messy. The CIA, local intelligence, everything turned lethal. She pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling old grief. I have always wondered if he survived. Now you say he has died, and I suppose there is closure in that knowledge, though it is bittersweet. They spoke for hours, Anka describing the mission from her perspective. Edgar was an engineer assigned to maintain certain communication lines. He discovered the plight of Anka and others who had provided intelligence to the West. He used his position to arrange an extraction, but the plan was compromised, and at least 2 people were killed. Anka narrowly escaped immediate death, was captured, and ultimately survived the downfall of the regime. Edgar, never told otherwise, assumed she was gone. The loop they had set up, this radio frequency, remained a testament to that vow he made, to never abandon them. In the end, circumstances forced him to move on, though he never forgave himself. Marilyn felt Edgar's presence more keenly than ever, imagining how deeply these events had shaped him. His quiet, deliberate manner might have been a shield for all the sorrow he carried. She told Anka that she was grateful to hear the truth, that she believed Edgar would find peace in knowing Anka lived. Anka nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. I too am relieved, she said. All these decades, I thought perhaps he died during the last days of the regime. To know he survived, found love, had a life, that eases something in my soul. Marilyn returned to her hotel that night filled with somber gratitude. She had found the missing piece, the final mission that haunted Edgar. Anka's survival was the silent link that explained the renewed transmissions. Sometime in the last few years, Anka must have tested the station again, sending out calls for S, hoping he would hear. But Edgar, already sick or preoccupied, never answered. Or possibly he believed no one else was left to respond. Now that broadcast loop had become a ghost, echoing across decades. Marilyn resolved to bring this loop to a proper close. She spent a few more days in Bucharest, forging a tentative friendship with Anka, sharing bits of Edgar's life. She showed pictures of their wedding, their home, the small joys they had built. Anka smiled softly, lamenting that Edgar had known so much heartache, but also relieved he had found happiness. Marilyn promised to keep in touch, to share any final steps she took with the station. She felt it was the least she could do for the woman Edgar had once risked everything to save. Returning home, Marilyn carried a sense of completion. She no longer felt that Edgar was a stranger. She saw him instead as a man who had shielded her from a brutal reality out of love. Now, it fell to her to honor his memory by ending the broadcast that chained him to the past. Gregory, upon her return, was eager for updates. She recounted her meeting with Anka, her discoveries. He was amazed. So Edgar was never exactly a spy, but more a compassionate operative who used his engineering skills to connect these people. Marilyn nodded, voice trembling. Yes, and the loop is still calling for him. I need to finalize this. They packed up the shortwave receiver and prepared a final coded message. Marilyn wanted to respond with dignity, acknowledging that Edgar Delaney was gone, that the mission was complete. She typed variations with Gregory's help, referencing the codes from Edgar's notebook. After testing the message offline, they set up the receiver in the attic once more. Gregory hesitated. "Are you sure? Once we send this, the station might go quiet for good." Marilyn took a breath. That's what Edgar would want, for the station to let him rest. She keyed in the sequence, channeling the instructions from Edgar's logs. Yes, confirmed. Mission complete. They listened as the shortwave hum rose, and for a moment, the number station continued. Then, abruptly, the mechanical voice ceased. Static replaced it, then silence. Marilyn felt tears on her cheeks. The final chain that tethered Edgar's memory to that old conflict was severed. She inhaled, feeling a strange solemnity in the hush. Gregory switched off the equipment. The attic felt lighter somehow, as if years of burden were dissolving. The following days brought a sense of release. Marilyn found she could reminisce about Edgar without the gnawing feeling of an untold story overshadowing every memory. She also felt an urge to do something with Edgar's notebooks, with the knowledge of his quiet heroism. She didn't want it to vanish into obscurity. She reached out to a Cold War historical archive, where scholars collected personal accounts and technical artifacts from that era. They expressed keen interest. Soon, she was boxing up Edgar's meticulously labeled logs, the shortwave receiver, the Nova Scotia station references, and the notes referencing Romania. She wrote a short summary explaining how Edgar had maintained a hidden broadcast to ensure no ally was left behind, how he had lived with the guilt of a failed rescue. When the day came to ship these materials, Marilyn found it surprisingly emotional. She had grown fond of them as the final link to Edgar's secret. Yet she believed the world should know that such silent acts of devotion existed. The archive's curator wrote back, deeply moved by the story, promising that Edgar's contributions would be preserved for future generations to study. Marilyn found comfort in that. She imagined a corner of the museum, perhaps a small display, Edgar Delaney, guardian of promises. People passing by might pause, read about the unheralded men and women who risked everything during the Cold War. Maybe they would reflect on how many private sacrifices remained unrecognized. Time drifted on. Marilyn visited the archive once the display was set up, standing quietly as visitors passed the glass case holding Edgar's radio, the typed code logs, and a plaque summarizing his role. She saw a few people stop, read, exchange murmured comments about how interesting or sad it was. She blinked back tears, feeling Edgar's presence as strongly as ever. She could almost hear him whispering gratitude for helping him let go of that final burden. At home, she slowly adjusted to living alone. She busied herself with volunteer work, assisting at a local library's reading program. Some days, grief welled up unexpectedly. She missed Edgar's small routines, the calm hush of his presence. But she found a quiet strength in knowing that she had uncovered the hidden chapter of his life. She thought about Anka, living in Bucharest, free from the past but still carrying scars. She wrote to Anka occasionally, sharing updates. Anka's replies were short, warm, often referencing how she sometimes played old radio tunes, thinking of Edgar. She ended each letter with the Romanian word for gratitude, mulțumesc, as if acknowledging that, through Marilyn, Edgar had finally fulfilled his vow. One bright morning, Marilyn rose early, took a small bouquet of flowers, and drove to Edgar's grave. She knelt by the headstone, tracing the inscription of his name. In the stillness of the cemetery, she spoke aloud, telling him about her travels, about how she had typed the final code that ended the broadcast. She recalled Anka's story, how his heroic attempt had truly saved her life, even if the plan failed for others. You carried that guilt, but also this unwavering loyalty. Now the signal is silent, my love, she said softly. You can rest. A gentle breeze stirred, rustling the grass. She felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were not bitter tears. They carried acceptance, the knowledge that love can persist even when built on unspoken burdens. Edgar had quietly borne the weight of a broken mission, never seeking praise or redemption. In discovering his secret, she had not found betrayal. Instead, she found the depth of his compassion, the quiet heroism of a man who refused to abandon his comrades, even from half a world away. She later told Gregory about her visit to the grave, about how she felt a new serenity. Gregory smiled, expressing relief that she found closure. He admitted the entire saga had shaken him, revealing the hidden complexity in people's lives. He said that Edgar would always remain an inspiration, reminding them that sometimes great acts of loyalty unfold without fanfare or medals. Marilyn nodded, grateful for Gregory's unwavering help. In a sense, he had carried Edgar's legacy forward, bridging the gap between old and new technology, unveiling a story that might otherwise have remained buried in dusty archives. Marilyn considered whether to visit Nova Scotia again, to fully shut down Operation Nightfall's physical station. Perhaps it was best left as a relic, silent. She decided that if the Canadian authorities or the Historical Society wished to preserve it, they could handle the specifics. She had done her part. The station's transmissions no longer sought ES. No further ghosts remained. She wrote to the local historical board, informing them of the compound's location, politely suggesting they secure the site or treat it as a Cold War exhibit. That was her final nod to the place that once buzzed with Edgar's coded transmissions. In the months that followed, her life found a new balance. She hosted small get-togethers with friends, read more widely, and occasionally gave informal talks at the library about the intricacies of old radio systems. She never mentioned Edgar's personal link to clandestine operations, only explaining how number stations once thrived in a predigital world. She saw in people's fascinated eyes the same wonder she had felt that first night in the attic, hearing a strange voice reciting coded lines. By gently sharing that piece of history, she felt she honored Edgar's memory in a measured way, without exposing all the personal pain. When a year passed since Edgar's death, she organized a modest memorial in her garden, inviting close family and a few dear friends. She set up a photo display, images of Edgar as a young engineer, him leaning over a circuit board, him perched at their living room table with a radio transmitter, and simpler scenes of him laughing at a barbecue or planting flowers. She did not mention the station or the secrets of Romania, but in her short speech, she alluded to the depth of Edgar's loyalty. "He carried burdens none of us fully knew," she said quietly, "but he never stopped giving of himself. I hope we can all learn from that quiet devotion." People murmured agreement, some wiping tears. After that gathering, she found Kay, her sister, in the kitchen. Kay had always been close to Marilyn, though they had parted ways in life. Kay embraced her, saying, "I'm proud of how you've kept Edgar's memory alive. I know it hasn't been easy." Marilyn nodded, tears threatening. She confided in Kay a partial version of the journey, explaining that Edgar had been part of secret radio operations that left him with regrets. Kay listened, eyes wide, yet offered no judgment. She simply said, "He was a good man. That's what counts." Indeed, that was what Marilyn told herself each time she felt the pang of what might have been if Edgar had shared his secrets earlier. She recognized that he likely believed silence was his only option, to keep her safe from involvement or heartbreak. Now that she knew, she could only cherish the fullness of who he was. Some nights, she dreamed of him, standing in the attic, adjusting dials, turning to smile at her with that gentle affection in his eyes. She would wake, comforted by the sense that she had walked by his side in the final resolution of his life's mission. One day, she received a letter from the Cold War Historical Archive, stating that Edgar's exhibit was garnering quiet attention from researchers. Some found the technical details fascinating. Others admired the personal dimension of a man who maintained a covert link out of loyalty. The curator wrote that a small plaque now accompanied the display, "Edgar Delaney, Guardian of Promises," just as Marilyn had suggested. Reading that, Marilyn felt a warm ache in her chest. She wondered if visitors paused, reading those words, imagining the events behind them. Possibly they would think of him as a footnote in the grand sweep of Cold War politics. But to her, he was everything. Husband, confidant, keeper of secrets. She decided to return to Nova Scotia once more, a year and a half after the first trip. This time, she went alone, wanting to see the station in its final quiet state. She drove the same route, found the fence, saw the battered sign. The difference was that the door to the main building was now locked with a new chain, presumably placed by local authorities after her tip. She peered through the fence, feeling a pang of nostalgia for that moment she first stepped inside. She whispered a soft farewell to the building, the hum that once broadcast Edgar's coded messages. Then she left, a sense of finality settling around her like a gentle cloak. She did not need to see more. The station's story was told, and she had done her part. As she flew home, she reflected on how a single curiosity, plugging in an old receiver, had transformed her world, unveiling a hidden tapestry beneath her marriage's surface. Yet that tapestry did not diminish their love. It enriched it, showing how profoundly Edgar had cared for the people he tried to save. She had discovered a love that spanned decades of secrecy, forging a path of quiet heroism. She felt honored to have been the one to hear the last echoes of that signal and to close the loop. In the weeks that followed, she periodically exchanged letters with Anka, who expressed relief that the station was silent now. All these years, I wondered if I was alone in remembering what happened, Anka wrote. Thank you, Marilyn, for letting me know Edgar's heart was always with us. I pray we can both find peace. Marilyn wrote back, describing how the museum exhibit ensured that Edgar's role wouldn't vanish. She left out the personal details, focusing on how Anka's survival meant more than any official recognition could. She ended with a promise that if Anka ever visited the United States, she would be welcomed like family. Life resumed its gentle routine. Marilyn found solace in small acts, tending her garden, hosting neighbors for tea, occasionally flipping through Edgar's old photos. She discovered that while the pang of missing him never fully vanished, it had evolved into a quiet presence that accompanied her daily. She felt his spirit in the subtle hum of the nighttime air, in the crackle of static on a radio station scanning for signals. Some signals, she realized, endured beyond words, a phenomenon that Edgar's life had embodied. They lingered until someone finally answered. On a warm afternoon in late spring, she took a drive to a local park, where she and Edgar used to stroll. She found a bench overlooking a small pond, sat with the sunlight glinting off the water. The memory of him at her side felt so vivid that tears threatened. Yet a calm spread through her. She whispered, "You can rest now, my love. I understand." A breeze rippled across the pond, carrying a sense of gentle affirmation. She pictured Edgar's gentle smile, the tilt of his head as if to say, "Thank you." Time moved on, and so did Marilyn, but not in a way that meant leaving Edgar behind. She integrated his story into her own. She told bits of it to a new friend at the library, who was a retired historian. He listened in awe, remarking that the Cold War was full of unsung stories like Edgar's, stories that rarely saw the light. Marilyn agreed, quietly proud that she had helped preserve at least one. She sensed a subtle shift in her sense of self, a confidence she never had before. She had traversed an international labyrinth of secrets, confronted the possibility that her husband was more than she knew, and emerged with greater love for him. On the second anniversary of Edgar's death, she visited his grave again, bringing fresh flowers. She also brought a single photograph for the small plastic sleeve behind the headstone, one of her in Nova Scotia, standing by the chain-link fence, the outline of Operation Nightfall in the background. She wrote on the back, "We closed the loop." She placed it gently behind the headstone. Then she sat in the grass, remembering him as the quiet engineer who had once shown her how to wire a lamp, explaining current and voltage in that calm, patient tone. She remembered how he had a soft spot for classical music, especially Debussy's Clair de Lune, which he said felt like the hush of radio static turned into melody. She hummed a bit of it, tears gathering, feeling him near. In the days following, people occasionally asked how she was coping. She smiled, saying she was well, that she had found purpose in preserving Edgar's memory and caring for others. She even hosted a small workshop at the library about shortwave radio history, enthralling a handful of visitors with the story of number stations. She never revealed the personal angle, but those who knew her well sensed it was more than just historical interest. They saw a glow in her face when she spoke of the signals, as if she carried an intimate understanding that those transmissions were more than relics. They were vessels of hope and loyalty. When the Cold War Historical Archive wrote a piece for their newsletter about Edgar Delaney, quoting pieces from his logs, they sent Marilyn a copy. She read it by lamplight, heart fluttering with pride. The article praised Edgar's devotion to saving endangered contacts, noting that not all heroes stand on the battlefield. Some quietly maintain the lines of communication that keep others alive. Marilyn thought that captured his essence perfectly. She set the newsletter in a scrapbook she kept of all things Edgar. Next to it, she pasted a small clipping from their wedding announcement, bridging the personal and historical. Sometimes, late at night, she found herself upstairs in the attic again. She would run her hand over the old shortwave receiver, remembering that first moment she heard the cryptic broadcast. Now the device was silent, no transmissions beckoning for ES. She could power it on, scan the bands, maybe pick up some faint signals from distant lands. But she preferred to let it rest. The ghost that once lived in its circuits had been laid to rest, too. She would stand there, thinking about how a single choice to power on a dusty radio set had changed her life. And she would smile, a quiet, tearful smile, grateful that she had walked that path. A subtle subplot emerged in her life when she discovered a gentle friendship with a neighbor, Charles, who occasionally helped fix things around her house. He was a widower as well, and they bonded over shared losses. Their friendship never threatened the memory of Edgar. It merely showed Marilyn that companionship could still be found in life's later chapters. She and Charles would talk about everything from gardening to classic films, gradually forming a supportive bond. In her mind, she recognized that Edgar would have wanted her to find warmth in others. Sometimes she shared glimpses of the radio saga, though she kept the deeper secrets private. Charles, in turn, told her stories of his own late wife, the small regrets he carried. They became each other's confidants, bridging the solitude of loss. As time flowed toward the 3rd anniversary of Edgar's passing, Marilyn felt a calling to finalize one more detail. She traveled again to the Cold War Historical Archive, meeting the curator. She donated a personal letter from Edgar, the one in which he had said if the signals reactivated, it meant some piece of his past needed resolution. She also included a short note of her own, giving context. She asked that the letter be sealed for a decade before being displayed. The curator nodded, understanding the sensitivity. The knowledge that it would someday be revealed, allowing future researchers to see the human dimension behind those coded messages, comforted her. She left the archive feeling a sense of lightness. Her story with Edgar was not a closed book, but a living testament shared with the world. She had no illusions that crowds of people would flock to read about him. But somewhere, a handful of inquisitive souls might stumble upon his logs, realize the courage in his silent devotion, and be touched by it. That was enough for her. Finally, one sunny afternoon, she decided to type a short, concluding reflection into her personal journal. In discovering Edgar's secret, I discovered the depth of his love. He was never lost. He was always sending signals, waiting for someone who cared enough to hear them. Perhaps that is the nature of loyalty. It resonates in the quiet, carrying on until the day it can rest. She closed the journal, hugging it to her chest, the same way she once held Edgar's old letters. Then she set it aside, stepping out into the garden to breathe the fresh air of a day free of lingering shadows. Thank you for watching to the end. If you found this story meaningful, please do like and subscribe for more.